If D&C 132 seems strange compared to other LDS scripture, it should. There are at least 7 reasons why so many feel something is not right with this purported revelation that promotes polygamy. D&C 132, attributed to the prophet Joseph Smith, didn't emerge publicly until 8 years after his death, in glaring contradiction to his many public condemnations of polygamy, the Book of Mormon, and the revisions he made to the Old Testament in his inspired translation of the Bible, or JST. Most importantly, before his death, Joseph specifically denied the legitimacy of the polygamous portions of D&C 132. Disturbingly, after Joseph's death, church leaders altered and suppressed historical documents that threatened to undermine the legitimacy of polygamy. Emma Smith, whom the Lord identified as an elect lady, consistently claims she was Joseph's only wife and that he never had any other wife of any type. Overturning spurious claims, modern DNA analysis indicates that Joseph Smith fathered children only with his wife Emma, and evidence from key historical documents indicates material inconsistencies in the traditionally accepted origin story for D&C 132, which we'll consider in this video. The evidence for these other problematic aspects is available in videos linked in the description. The day the church publicly announced polygamy for the first time, Brigham claimed, quote, "The original copy of this revelation, meaning D&C 132, was burnt up. William Clayton was the man who wrote it from the mouth of the prophet. In the meantime, it was in Bishop Whitney's possession. He wished the privilege to copy it, which Brother Joseph granted. Sister Emma burnt the original. The reason I mention this is because that the people who did know of the revelation suppose it is not now in existence. The only surviving manuscript of the revelation, according to Brigham, was a copy Bishop Whitney asked Joseph Kingsbury to create. That's how the Kingsbury manuscript, shown here on the top half of the slide, became the church's source for D&C 132. But a second manuscript copy of the same revelation exists that raises important questions. The Kingsbury document on top and the Richards document on the bottom are both manuscripts of D&C 132. While Kingsbury is considered the original source document for D&C 132, the Richards document, so called because it's in the handwriting of Willard Richards, church historian and counselor in the First Presidency, contains edits that indicate it may have actually been created before the Kingsbury document. If the Richards document was created first, Brigham's story about the origin of the revelation known as D&C 132 cannot be true. Let's look at the edits in the Richards document and consider how likely Willard Richards would have been to make the potential mistakes he did if he actually had the completed Kingsbury document in front of him. There are 12 edits in the Richards document and 1 correction in the Kingsbury document that we'll consider. The first 11 alterations to the Richards document all read normally, meaning that the verbiage was coherent and not obviously problematic before any of those 11 alterations were made. The first curious pencil edit shows up in the first line of the Richards document, the date. At the top we see the Kingsbury document, supposedly the original source for the 2 different manuscript copies below it. In the Horace Whitney copy of the Kingsbury document in the middle, another copy of the revelation purportedly created in 1847, the scribe didn't have a problem identifying July 12th as the date in the Kingsbury document. So why, 5 years later and only 22 days before D&C 132 was released for the first time publicly, was the church historian Willard Richards, in his document at the bottom, not sure what day the purported revelation was received? In the Richards document, the question mark in pencil preceding the 12th most likely indicates that, when the edit was made, he still wasn't sure which date to assign to the revelation. And that edit happened on August 7, 1852, over 9 years after the revelation was supposedly received. The pencil edits made to the Richards document that we'll review in this presentation, considered alterations by whomever made them, were created on August 7, 1852. We know this because of this note left behind by the editor, which reads, "As altered in pencil, August 7, 52. Initial examination of the handwriting indicates these pencil changes were likely made by Willard Richards himself. If the Kingsbury document had come first, changes to the document would more appropriately have been considered corrections rather than alterations. The second edit in the Richards document changes the word "or" to the word "and," so that the original phrase "are not made or entered into" was changed to "are not made and entered into." Once again, we see a question mark in the edit, indicating uncertainty about editorial choice, rather than confusion over what the Kingsbury document says, as the equivalent Kingsbury text shown below is not ambiguous. Kingsbury below clearly reads, "are not made and entered into." If the Richards document was a copy of the Kingsbury text, it's hard to explain the question mark next to the word "and" in the Richards edit. The question mark most likely indicates editorial concern about optimal word choice. The 8th pencil edit in the Richards document is interesting. The Richards document on top reads, "Let my, mine, handmaid," as if the editor was trying to decide which of the two words would land better. The Kingsbury document below clearly reads, "Let mine, handmaid." The fact that Richards left both of the words my and mine in his document indicates he was likely considering the stylistic implications of the difference between the two, even though the phrase mine, handmaid had already been used 3 times previously in the same document. It doesn't make sense that he would have left the word my in his manuscript if he was simply copying the Kingsbury document. Edit 13 is a correction in the Kingsbury document that deserves attention. The Richards version, which is shown above, reads, "I say unto you as whatsoever," while the Kingsbury shown below reads, "I say unto you that whatsoever." It's not a substantive change qualitatively, but it matters because if Richards had been copying from the Kingsbury document, we'd expect the word that to show up in the Richards document, and it doesn't. It's important to understand that the word that in the Kingsbury document is a correction. In Kingsbury, the black ink text of the word that was written over the word as originally written in brown ink, which is visible in this magnified view. This implies that Kingsbury was originally a copy of Richards, and that when Kingsbury was subsequently changed from as to that, the correction was not carried back into the Richards document. The third edit in the Richards manuscript involves the insertion of a 6-word independent phrase and the keys of this priesthood. This error could be the result of a scribe mistakenly leaving out an entire phrase, with the verbiage before the change reading normally, or this could be an attempt to improve the believability of the text by qualitatively enhancing the content. The 5th and 7th pencil edits in the Richards manuscript insert the words thee and you into the same underlying phrase, "unto my servant Joseph." These edits could be the result of a scribe mistakenly leaving out these similar words in exactly the same place in exactly the same phrase twice, or they could be an attempt to improve the believability of the text by qualitatively enhancing the content in a uniform way. These changes shift both original instances from the third person talking about Joseph to the second person talking to Joseph. This apparent tinkering with point of view did not end here. D&C 132 was read publicly for the first time on August 29, 1852, and what was read was later published in the Deseret News. There we notice that the point of view was changed in the first line of the revelation to third person, followed immediately by the second person, possibly in an attempt to render moot the issue of changing point of view throughout the revelation. The Richards document on top reads, "Verily thus saith the Lord unto you, my servant Joseph," and the Kingsbury document just below reads exactly the same, "Verily thus saith the Lord unto you, my servant Joseph." But in the Deseret News or DN version, it reads, quote, "Verily thus saith the Lord unto his servant Joseph," which later got changed back to align with the Richards and Kingsbury versions, as we see in today's modern version or MV at the bottom. Quote, "Verily thus saith the Lord unto you, my servant Joseph." These changes suggest an evolutionary process of development for D&C 132. The 4th edit in the Richards document changes the phrase "this is eternal life" to "this is eternal lives." This type of error could be more likely to occur if somebody read the text to a scribe who transcribed it without being able to read the document himself. As church historian and member of the First Presidency, it's most likely that Richards would have had access to any pre-existing church history documents he wanted, including the Kingsbury document, if it had existed before the Richards document was created. Edit number 6 in the Richards document is interesting because it appears to be an attempt to materially change the nature of what had been restored through the prophet Joseph. Originally, the Richards document read that the Lord gave unto, quote, "my servant Joseph an appointment to restore all things." By replacing the word "to" with "and," this alteration attempts to change the restoration from something that was in progress through the prophet Joseph into something that was already completed. If it was already completed, then the church ostensibly had everything. Or this change was just correcting a copy error that happened to read coherently, but mean something very different, before the edit was made. Edits 9 and 11 in the Richards document bring up the question of consistency. These two edits both enhance the same underlying phrase, "I the Lord will," to "I the Lord thy God will," and "I the Lord his God will." The top edit, the addition of the word "thy God," appears to be in ink rather than pencil. It's interesting to note that the phrase "the Lord thy God" shows up 9 times in D&C 132. Richards edit number 9, seen at the top of the slide, shows up in verse 56 of D&C 132. The addition of the words "thy God" brings verse 56 into alignment with 7 previous instances of similar verbiage, as well as similar construction again in the following verse, verse 57. From that perspective, Richards edit 11, found in verse 65 of D&C 132 and shown at the bottom of the slide, fits into the same category. These alterations could have been caused by a scribe mistakenly omitting similar verbiage in both cases, or they could be editorial attempts to bring these phrases into alignment with the many similar phrases found elsewhere in the document. Edit number 10, the insertion of the word not into the original phrase, "Let my servant Joseph put his property out of his hands," is particularly interesting given the narrative developed in the Richards manuscript about a proposed exchange of property between Joseph and Emma. Verses 51, 55, and 57 tell a story that God commanded Joseph to offer Emma some property, which Emma was supposed to reject because it was actually a trial designed by God to prove them. In the original Richards document, Joseph was supposed to put property out of his hands by transferring it to Emma so she wouldn't, like Satan, seek to destroy him. Verse 51 reads, "Verily I say unto you, a commandment I give unto mine handmaid Emma Smith, your wife, whom I have given unto you, that she stay herself and partake not of that which I commanded you to offer unto her, for I did it, saith the Lord, to prove you all." Verse 55 explains that, quote, "If she will not abide this commandment, or doesn't allow Joseph to take plural wives, then shall my servant Joseph do all things for her, even as he hath said," which seems to refer to what Joseph was commanded in verse 51 to offer her, likely the lands mentioned later in verse 55, referring to the lots deeded by Joseph to Emma on the day D&C 132 was purportedly received, July 12, 1843. So now it becomes clearer why Richards might have changed the date from the 10th to the 12th of July, 1843, as the day this revelation was supposedly received, to align this narrative with Emma's purported rejection of this revelation on the same day. This aligns with the story Brigham would tell that Emma burned the original manuscript of the revelation. Emma claimed that she never saw this purported revelation until years after Joseph had died, and that Brigham's story of her burning the revelation was a complete lie. In the original Richards document, before the word not was added in, verse 57 aligned with verses 51 and 55, telling Joseph that he should put his property out of his hands or sign it over to Emma, because she was satanic and would seek to destroy him otherwise. Remember, verse 51 claimed that God commanded Joseph to make the offer to Emma, but somebody seemingly forgot about the overall narrative constructed in the earlier verses and inserted the not in verse 57 to implicate Joseph as well as Emma in the now inappropriate transfer of property out of Joseph's hands into Emma's. Ironically, edit 11 in the Richards document, seemingly intended to disparage Joseph, begins to destroy the internal consistency of the previously established narrative elements designed to malign Emma. Based on that interpretation, this edit also supports the hypothesis that the Richards document preceded the Kingsbury manuscript. In summary, alterations made to the Richards manuscript raise the possibility, if not the likelihood, that it was created before the Kingsbury document, and that the narrative was therefore undergoing substantive changes 3 weeks before the public disclosure of D&C 132. Remember, Brigham's story was that Kingsbury made his copy in 1843 and not after August of 1852, as the Richards edits indicate. Actually, Kingsbury himself, in his autobiography, inadvertently provides additional evidence that he didn't create his copy in 1843. You see, Kingsbury began creating his life history by his own hand in 1846, 3 years after he supposedly created the only remaining copy of D&C 132. In his autobiography, Kingsbury never mentions making a copy of the Revelation. Among other events in his life, Kingsbury mentions being baptized in 1832, being ordained an elder in 1833, in 1835 receiving a patriarchal blessing from Joseph Smith Sr., leaving on a mission to New York, and upon returning 3 months later, being called on to speak to the church by the prophet Joseph. In 1838, he moved his family to Far West, at least in part because, quote, President Joseph Smith Jr. and father and brother were making their way there, and in 1841 he moved his family to Nauvoo. In March of 1843, Kingsbury recorded a patriarchal blessing given to him by the prophet Joseph, after which the next entry reads, quote, I remained with Newell K. Whitney until 23 July 1843 and left Nauvoo. That's it, not a single mention of Kingsbury being asked to make the only surviving copy of D&C 132. This can't be an issue of Kingsbury trying to hide polygamy, because his autobiography openly mentions taking plural wives. If D&C 132 really happened as Brigham indicated, Kingsbury copying the original manuscript would have occurred in between those last two events on July 15, 1843. But Kingsbury doesn't mention it at all. And remember, he started writing his history in 1846, several years after he supposedly created the D&C 132 manuscript. If Kingsbury cared enough to include that the prophet Joseph asked him to give a talk in church after his 3-month mission to New York, I'm pretty sure he would have included his involvement in creating the only surviving copy of the most impactful revelation in church history, if it had actually happened. Incidentally, many years later, in 1870, Kingsbury signed an affidavit written by Joseph F. Smith, which claimed that Kingsbury created his manuscript copy of D&C 132 by listening as Bishop Newell K. Whitney dictated the original out loud. It reads, quote, "He wrote the revelation on celestial marriage from the mouth of Newell K. Whitney as he read from the original. But when Kingsbury wrote out a different affidavit in 1886, he changed his story, and in that version, Newell K. Whitney handed Kingsbury the original document and Kingsbury copied it himself. In Kingsbury's own words, quote, Newell K. Whitney handed me the revelation and asked me to take a copy of it. Those two accounts are materially different. Also, in the 1886 statement, after Kingsbury finished making the copy, Hiram Smith allegedly came into the room and retrieved the original document. He wrote, quote, Hiram Smith coming into the room at the time to fetch the original, Bishop Whitney handed it to him. But in his 1892 testimony in the Temple Lot case, Kingsbury changed that aspect of the story too. In that version, he claimed that after he'd finished copying the document, Hiram didn't come into the room to get the original document back, but stayed outside the room, and that Bishop Whitney delivered the newly created document to him outside the door. In Kingsbury's words, quote, he took the one that I had made and went out to the door and handed it to Hiram Smith, who was outside the door. Hiram had, of course, died in 1843, and Bishop Newell K. Whitney had passed away in 1850. Like we covered in the beginning, the Kingsbury document probably wasn't created until sometime after August 7th of 1852. So Kingsbury had to invent narrative details involving both Hiram Smith and Newell K. Whitney to try to make the story seem legitimate. When you make up a fake story, it can be difficult to maintain consistency over time. Kingsbury's autobiography indicates that his D&C 132 manuscript was created sometime after 1846. Edits in the Richards document indicate that the Kingsbury manuscript was likely created sometime after August 7th of 1852. While we don't know exactly when it was actually created, what matters is that the evidence consistently indicates that Kingsbury's manuscript was not created in 1843, and that Brigham's story about the origin of D&C 132 isn't credible. Important evidence indicates that D&C 132's attempt to legitimize polygamy is illegitimate. The reason D&C 132 seems so different from the rest of LDS scripture is because polygamy didn't come from God through the prophet Joseph Smith.